All right, ready to dive deep into this one. Gender. It's a big one.
It is.
We've got this academic text, really dives into it all. What gender is, the whole history, where the ideas came from, and why it all even matters.
Yeah, and honestly, it's going to be really interesting. You might even end up, questioning some things that you didn't even realize you thought about gender.
I think so too. Like right off the bat, one thing that was really interesting in this text, they made it clear, we always use sex, the gender, like they're the same thing.
Yeah.
But they're totally not.
No, not at all. Really important distinction. The text lays it out. Sex is just biology, male or female, what you're born with, chromosomes, all that.
So that's like the basic level. But gender is a whole other thing.
Way more complex. Yeah, it's like all the roles and the behaviors, the expectations, all that stuff that society puts on top of whether you're biologically male or female.
Okay.
So what we think of as like masculine or feminine, a lot of times it's not actually biological, it's cultural. It's learned, basically. And get this idea, it was like revolutionary when psychiatrists first started talking about it, back in the 50s and 60s even.
Really? So like everything we think we know about what it means to be a man or a woman, it's just stuff we've learned.
A lot of it is, yeah. And it changes so much between cultures, different time periods. It's not fixed. Actually, the text that has this whole table compares sex and gender, and it really highlights how much gender can change based on like where you are, what time period it is, that kind of thing.
Wow. Okay. So before we get too deep into the weeds here, I feel like we need to define some stuff, like basic terms.
Yeah, good idea.
It's like, I need a gender glossary.
Sure. Well, the source gives us a few big ones to start. First one is gender roles.
Okay.
So think of it like specific duties, rights, privileges, stuff that society assigns to men and women. Like back in the day, it was breadwinner versus homemaker.
Yeah.
Or even just pants versus skirts, that kind of thing.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense. But what about like how we feel inside about gender?
Yeah, that's gender identity.
Right.
That's your own internal sense of yourself, whether you feel male, female, maybe somewhere in between.
Okay.
Total separate thing from sexual orientation, like who you're attracted to.
Oh, interesting. So feeling like a man or a woman inside doesn't mean you're automatically attracted to one or the other.
Got it.
Okay. Now there's this term. It sounds kind of intense. Gender stratification?
Oh, yeah, don't worry. It's not that complicated. It basically means that power and resources, they aren't equal between men and women.
Right.
So like in most societies, men still have more power, more access to stuff than women do. Think of it like the pay gap. Women often get paid less for the same job. That's gender stratification at work.
Ugh, yeah, I hate that that's still a thing. Okay, last term from our little glossary here. Gender stereotypes. These are those like overgeneralizations. Like all men are emotionless robots and all women are super emotional all the time.
Exactly. And honestly, those stereotypes can be really harmful because it boxes people in, limits what they think they can do. Like, think about toys, how they're marketed. Girls get dolls, paint kitchens, boys get action figures, construction sets. It starts so young.
Yeah, it's like teaching kids to fit those stereotypes from the moment they're born, almost.
Yeah.
Crazy.
Yeah.
But here's the thing. Why do these roles and these stereotypes even exist in the first place?
That's where it gets really interesting. The source, it dives into a bunch of different theories that try to explain all this.
Oh, okay. Sounds like we're about to get all psychology 101 up in here.
A little bit, yeah. So first theory is evolutionary theory. This one says these differences between men and women, it's all about biology.
Okay.
Developed over a long time to help our ancestors survive, reproduce. So men were the hunters, protectors, women were caregivers, nurturers, classic caveman stuff.
So we're basically hardwired to act a certain way because of cavemen.
Well, the theory says that, yeah, but it does kind of sound like, well, we have no choice then, right?
Yeah, like we're just destined to be a certain way. It doesn't really seem fair.
Right. It's a good point. And, evolution, it might explain some biological differences, but it doesn't explain all the cultural differences we see in gender roles around the world. Like, it's not all biology.
Okay, that makes sense. So what's the next theory then?
We've got object relations theory.
Yeah.
This one's more about your childhood, your early experiences, specifically the bond you have with your main caregiver, usually your mom.
Okay.
This theory says boys and girls, they develop different senses of self because they have to, separate from their mom in different ways.
Wait, hold on. What does separating from your mom have to do with your gender?
Okay, so boys, they have to make a more distinct break, to develop that masculine identity, while girls, they can stay closer to mom. And this whole process shapes how they relate to other people later in life.
Huh, interesting. Makes you think about how much those early years really impact us, even if we don't realize it. Okay, what about gender schema theory? That one sounds a little more like brain-focused.
It is. It's more cognitive. This one says we build these mental frameworks, schemas, about what it means to be male or female based on what we see around us, who we interact with. And then we take new information, we categorize it as either male or female, and we try to make ourselves fit into those categories.
So it's like we're constantly creating these mental shortcuts to make sense of gender, but those shortcuts can lead us to stereotypes, right?
Exactly. And then finally, we've got social role theory. This one focuses on the division of labor. So men and women, they get assigned different tasks, different responsibilities, and those roles, well, they shape our expectations about how they should act.
Oh, I see. So like if men are traditionally the ones who work and bring home the money, we start to associate them with being strong and independent, right?
Yeah.
And then women, they're often given caregiving roles, so we see them as nurturing, emotional. It's all a self-fulfilling prophecy kind of thing.
Totally. And here's the thing. None of these theories fully explains it on its own. It's probably a combination of biology, early experiences, how our brains develop, and how society is structured, all those things together.
Wow. Talk about a complex puzzle. Okay, so we've got all this theory swirling around, but how does this actually play out in real life? How do we actually learn to do gender every day?
Great question. Our source highlights 4 main ways this happens. 4 processes of gender socialization.
Okay, tell me everything.
Okay, so the first one's manipulation. Basically, how we treat baby boys and baby girls differently, even from when they're first born.
Like how we dress girls in pink and tell them to be delicate, and we dress boys in blue and roughhouse with them.
Exactly. Then there's canalization, which is all about directing kids towards certain toys, certain activities, certain interests, all based on their gender. Remember those gendered toy aisles?
Ugh, yes.
It starts there.
It's all connected, yeah. Okay, what else?
We've got verbal appellations. This is about the words we use to describe boys and girls. So we might call a boy strong and athletic, but call a girl pretty and sweet. Again, reinforcing those stereotypes from a young age.
Wow. Okay, and then lastly,
there's activity exposure. This is about the different chores, activities we give to boys and girls. Boys mow the lawn, girls help with dishes. All of that shapes those expectations about what they should be doing. It all works together, to teach kids what it means to be male or female in their culture.
It's kind of blowing my mind. I'm thinking about my own childhood now. All those little messages you just don't even realize you're absorbing. It's amazing how much those subtle things impact us.
It really is. Hard to escape, honestly. But by becoming aware of it all, we can start to challenge it, make things more equal for everyone.
Right, absolutely. Okay, so we've talked about the personal level, but let's zoom out a bit. Think bigger picture. How is globalization impacting all of this? It seems like things would get even more complex when you factor in different cultures, the global economy, all that.
For sure. The source talks about this. Says globalization is kind of a double-edged sword for women.
Okay, so it's not all good or all bad, it's complicated.
Very. So on one hand, globalization creates new opportunities, economic opportunities, especially in developing countries. Women have access to jobs, financial independence.
Yeah, that's a good thing for sure. But what about the other side of that? What are the downsides?
Well, there's always the risk of exploitation. So these big companies, transnational organizations, they might use women for cheap labor. In industries where the pay is low, working conditions are bad because they know women might be more likely to accept those jobs because they don't have other options.
It's like globalization creates winners and losers, and sometimes women end up being the losers if we're not careful.
It's a valid concern. And it's not just about economics either. Globalization can also affect gender roles and norms, but in really complex ways. Like Western media and culture spreading all over the place can actually challenge traditional roles in some places, but in other places it just reinforces them.
Wow, so it's not a simple equation.
Nope, not at all. Globalization affects different places differently. Always changing, too. It's important to be aware of all the different ways it impacts gender.
All right, my head is spinning. We've covered so much already in this deep dive. Historical stuff, laws, real-world examples, and now we're adding globalization to the mix. It's a lot to process.
It's a lot, yeah.
But we're not done yet.
Nope. There's one more huge piece of the puzzle. We need to talk about the media.
Oh, yeah. Can't forget about that.
Huge impact on how we understand gender. That's where we'll pick things up next time. It's interesting, how these ideas about gender, they play out on like a global scale. Our source actually talks about the legal side of things, the history of women's legal status, and the role of the UN in trying to make things more equal for women around the world.
Okay, so let's back up a bit. What's the historical background for all of this? Where do we even begin with this whole conversation about gender and the law?
Well, the UN has been super important in pushing for women's rights internationally, and it goes all the way back to 1945 when they adopted the UN Charter.
Okay.
That document, it was huge. It was the first international agreement that said, straight up, all human beings are equal, no matter their sex.
1945, that feels like both a really long time ago and also kind of recent in terms of like big social changes.
Yeah.
But I imagine saying everyone's equal and actually making it happen are two very different things.
Oh, yeah, totally. And the UN knew that. They weren't naive. They knew just declaring equality wasn't enough. They had to figure out like how to actually make it a reality. So they focused on two main things: making laws to protect women's rights and gathering data on the status of women globally.
So it's about understanding the problem first and then creating the legal tools to actually address it. Makes sense. But how do you even begin to collect data on something as complex as gender equality across so many different cultures and countries? It seems like a massive undertaking.
Oh, it is. It's huge. But the UN, they were up for it. They came up with ways to collect statistics on women's lives, did all this research on the issues women were facing. They even helped different countries, gave them technical support to incorporate gender perspectives into their development plans.
Okay, so they were really laying the groundwork, both understanding the problem and coming up with ways to address it. That's impressive. But what about concrete actions? Did the UN actually do anything specific to promote gender equality globally?
Absolutely. They held these big global conferences specifically focused on women's rights and gender equality. They had 4 major ones, brought together governments, activists, experts, all these people from all over the world to basically brainstorm and make commitments to actually take action.
Oh, okay, conference time. Let's talk about those. What was the first one?
The very first UN World Conference on Women, it was in Mexico City back in 1975. It's often seen as like the kickoff point for the modern global women's rights movement. Over 113 countries participated. It was huge. And they came up with this world plan of action, which outlined concrete steps to, try to make progress on gender equality over the next 10 years.
In 1975.
Yeah.
That feels like a really pivotal year for so many social movements. What were some of the big things they talked about at that first conference? What were they trying to achieve?
They had 3 main goals. First was eliminating discrimination, achieving full gender equality. Second was integrating women into development efforts, making sure women were part of all those plans for economic growth and social progress. And third was increasing women's contribution to world peace. They really saw women's empowerment as essential for peace.
It's really interesting how they connected women's rights to these bigger issues like global development and peace. Shows they understood that gender equality isn't just a women's issue. It's essential for a better world for everyone.
Exactly. And that first conference, it also led to the creation of some important UN organizations, ones that focus specifically on women's issues, like the International Research and Training Institute for the Advancement of Women and the UN Development Fund for Women.
Okay.
Those organizations have been crucial in continuing the work that started in Mexico City.
So they weren't just talking. They were putting structures in place to actually keep this momentum going. Okay, so Mexico City was a big one. What about the next conference? What happened after that?
5 years later, in 1980, they had the second UN World Conference on Women. It was in Copenhagen. And this one was really about reviewing the progress that had been made since Mexico City, like checking in, seeing how things were going.
So a progress report. I'm guessing it was probably a mix of good news and areas where they realized they still needed to do a lot more work.
Yeah, pretty much. There were definitely some positive developments, but the review also showed that there was still a big gap between, the rights women had on paper, legally speaking, and their ability to actually use those rights in real life.
Right, because just because a law exists doesn't mean it's automatically enforced or that people are aware of their rights.
Yeah.
Right. So what were some of the main obstacles they identified? What was holding things back?
Well, they talked about a few things. One was a lack of political will from some governments. Basically, some countries just weren't really committed to actually making these changes happen. And then there was also the issue of funding. A lot of programs aimed at helping women just didn't have enough money to actually be effective. And then, of course, there were still inadequate support services for women, and a lot of people still didn't even know about women's rights or the opportunities that were supposed to be available to them.
Okay, so it sounds like they were starting to realize that changing laws and policies wasn't enough. You also had to change people's minds. You had to address the underlying social norms and attitudes that were perpetuating inequality.
Yeah, exactly. And that realization led to the third UN World Conference on Women, which was held in Nairobi, Kenya in 1985. And that one was really significant because it marked the emergence of a truly global feminist movement. Women from all over the world came together, united in this fight for equality, development, and peace.
Nairobi, 1985. Sounds like a pretty powerful moment. A global feminist movement, you said.
It was, and it led to the adoption of the Nairobi Forward-Looking Strategies, which was basically a 15-year plan for advancing women's rights.
Wow, 15 years. That's thinking long term.
Right. And this document really emphasized that all issues are women's issues. It wasn't just about specific things that only affect women. It was about making sure that women's needs and concerns were considered in every area of development, every policy decision.
Okay, so they were broadening the scope, moving beyond just those traditional women's issues, and showing how gender equality is relevant to everything. So we've got Mexico City, Copenhagen, and Nairobi. What about the fourth conference? Where did they go next?
The fourth UN World Conference on Women was held in Beijing, China in 1995. And this one was huge, like landmark event. Over 17,000 people participated. It got tons of international attention.
Wow, 17,000 participants. That's incredible. The movement was definitely gaining momentum.
Oh, yeah, big time. And the Beijing conference, it was really important because it reaffirmed this idea that women's rights are human rights. It's not a separate thing. It's all connected. And they adopted the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, which was this super comprehensive roadmap for achieving gender equality.
Okay, break that down for me. What exactly was in this Platform for Action? What did they focus on?
Oh, it covered so much. Poverty, education, health, violence against women, armed conflict, the economy, political participation, even the environment. It was incredibly thorough, like trying to tackle every single aspect of women's lives.
It sounds like they were really connecting the dots, showing how gender inequality impacts everything, from the very personal level to global politics.
Exactly. And they didn't just point out problems, they actually proposed solutions. They called on governments to take concrete steps to promote gender equality, like passing new laws, changing policies, and actually giving money to women's programs.
So it was about putting pressure on those in power to actually walk the walk, not just talk the talk.
Yeah.
Did they also talk about the role of regular people, civil society and grassroots movements in pushing for gender equality?
Oh, yeah, for sure. They knew that real change requires everyone to be involved. Governments, international organizations, and everyday people all working together.
Makes sense. It's a collective effort. Okay, so we've covered these 4 big UN conferences on women. What else has the UN done to advance gender equality?
Well, besides the conferences, they've been really active in doing research, providing training, and advocating for gender equality. They developed ways to track statistics on things like women's work, researched all the different aspects of women's lives, and helped countries figure out how to integrate gender into their development programs.
So they're really trying to make a difference on multiple levels, not just talking about it, but actually getting involved, helping to support women around the world in tangible ways. It's pretty amazing to see how much work they've done. Clearly, the UN has made a huge impact on pushing for gender equality globally.
Absolutely. Of course, there's still a lot more to do, but those international efforts have, created a structure for action and really helped to build this powerful global movement for women's rights.
Right. Okay, so we've talked about the big picture, the global perspective, but I'm curious to see how those global trends translate to a specific country. Does our source give any examples? Like, how is a particular country actually implementing these ideas?
It does. The source talks about Ethiopia as a case study. And it acknowledges that Ethiopia, like many other countries, has a history of traditional practices that are harmful to women.
Yeah, I'm thinking things like child marriage, female genital mutilation, and abduction, right? Those deeply ingrained cultural practices that have such devastating consequences for women and girls.
Exactly. Really tough issues. But the source also points out that there have been some serious efforts in recent years to try to address these problems and promote gender equality in Ethiopia.
That's good to hear. What specifically are they doing to make a difference? What kind of actions are they taking?
Well, first of all, Ethiopia has signed on to a bunch of international conventions and treaties that support women's rights, including CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women.
Okay, so they're acknowledging those global standards. But signing a treaty is one thing. Actually putting it into practice is a whole other challenge. What's happening on that front? Are they actually implementing those ideas?
Yeah, they've actually done quite a bit. On a national level, Ethiopia has put in place various laws, policies, and institutions specifically designed to advance women's rights. They even have a national policy on Ethiopian women, which is all about creating conditions for equality between men and women.
So it's about taking a comprehensive approach, not just focusing on individual harmful practices, but really trying to create a framework for gender equality across all aspects of life.
Exactly. And it's not just empty words. They've backed up this policy with concrete actions. Like they've set up women's affairs offices at different levels of government whose job is to oversee and coordinate all these different gender programs.
So they're creating specific structures to make sure that gender issues are actually being addressed, that they're a priority. Smart.
Right. And they've also made a lot of progress in incorporating gender perspectives into other important areas like agriculture, education, healthcare, and efforts to reduce poverty.
So they're recognizing that gender equality isn't just a separate issue. It's something that needs to be woven into every aspect of development and policy.
Exactly. And they're working on reforming laws that discriminate against women, trying to make sure women have equal access to the justice system. It's a big undertaking.
It sounds like they're really trying to address the systemic issues that perpetuate gender inequality. Taking a multi-pronged approach, that's encouraging.
It's definitely a step in the right direction.
Yeah.
And while there are obviously still a lot of challenges ahead, these efforts show that Ethiopia is really committed to moving towards gender equality.
It gives me hope to see these concrete actions being taken to address such deeply entrenched problems. It shows that change is possible, even in places where traditions and social norms have been resistant to progress.
Absolutely. It's proof that progress is possible, but it takes a lot of effort and a willingness to challenge the status quo.
Okay, so we've talked about the history, the laws, and some real-world examples of how countries are trying to make things better. But there's one last piece of this puzzle we need to talk about: globalization. How does all this fit into the bigger picture of a rapidly globalizing world?
You're right. Globalization is this massive force that's reshaping everything. And its impact on gender is complicated, often contradictory. On one hand, it's opened up a lot of economic opportunities for women, global markets, new jobs, and all sorts of industries.
Yeah, we hear a lot about how globalization empowers women by giving them more economic independence and control over their own lives.
And there's truth to that, for sure. But globalization can also make existing inequalities worse, especially for women who are already vulnerable and marginalized.
Right. We can't ignore the negative side of globalization.
Right.
Like how women are sometimes exploited as cheap labor in industries with really terrible working conditions.
Exactly. The source specifically mentions concerns about these big transnational corporations using women as a source of cheap labor, especially in things like garment manufacturing. They might accept lower wages and harsher conditions because they don't have many other options.
It's like, yeah, globalization can lift some people up, but it can also push others down. We have to be really careful about protecting the rights of those who are most vulnerable to exploitation.
Absolutely. And it's not just economics either. Globalization can also affect gender roles and norms, but in really complicated ways. Like Western media and culture spreading all over the world can sometimes challenge traditional gender roles, but in other cases it actually reinforces them.
It's fascinating how all these global flows of information and culture, they interact with local contexts in these unpredictable ways.
Yeah, it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. Globalization plays out differently depending on where you are and when you're talking about. It's always changing, too, so we have to keep learning about all the different ways it impacts gender.
Well, my brain is definitely full after all of that. We've covered so much ground in this deep dive. Historical stuff, laws, specific countries, and now globalization. It's a lot to take in.
Yeah, it's a lot, but we're not done yet.
Oh, right. There's one more big piece we need to talk about: the media.
Exactly. We'll dive into that whole world of media representation and its impact on gender in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, so we're back, ready for the last part of our deep dive into gender.
Let's do it.
This time we're tackling a big one: the media. We were just talking about globalization, but now let's really zoom in on how media shapes our ideas about what it means to be male or female.
It's a huge topic. I mean, media is everywhere, right?
It is.
We're constantly seeing images, messages, stories, and all that stuff influences how we see the world, including gender.
For sure. And I feel like with gender, media can be, I don't know, kind of a double-edged sword. Sometimes it challenges those old stereotypes, shows us more inclusive representations. But then other times, it's like It's just reinforcing all those traditional gender roles we've been talking about, pushing those same old harmful stereotypes.
Yeah, you're right. It's both. Like, think about all the stereotypical stuff we see. In movies, TV shows, ads, even the news, women are either like hypersexualized objects or they're just housewives, you know?
Yeah, and men are always the strong, stoic type, never show any emotions.
Exactly. It's like we're stuck with these outdated ideas of what men and women should be.
Totally. And it can be really limiting, especially for young people. Like, they're still figuring out who they are, what they want to be. But if all they see are these narrow, unrealistic portrayals...
It's hard to break out of that, right? You start to feel like you have to fit into these boxes.
Yeah. Like, if you're a woman, you have to be beautiful and caring. And if you're a man, you have to be tough and successful. Ugh.
It's like those messages get into your head and you don't even realize it. They shape how you see yourself, how you see other people. It's tricky.
It is. But hey, it's not all bad news, right? I feel like things are changing, at least a little. We are seeing more diversity, more inclusivity in media these days.
Definitely. It's been a gradual shift, but now we have more women making movies, writing, producing. So we're getting more stories from their perspective, more complex female characters.
Yeah, for sure. Like, think about shows like Fleabag or Killing Eve. Those have such great female characters. Strong, but also flawed. Interesting. It's so refreshing.
Right. And it's not just about women either. We need to see men portrayed in more diverse ways, too.
Yes, we need to move past those one-dimensional, like, super masculine stereotypes. The stoic hero, the breadwinner who never cries. It's just not realistic, and it's not healthy.
Exactly. Men can be vulnerable, they can be emotional, and there are so many different ways to be masculine. We need to see more of that range represented in media.
Totally. Because when we do see more diverse, more relatable portrayals of gender, it helps us see what's possible. It can challenge our own biases, maybe even inspire us to create a more equal world.
For sure. It's like seeing those different portrayals gives us permission to be ourselves, to break out of those limiting norms.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But it's not just about making new content, right? It's also about being critical of the media we're already consuming, recognizing those sneaky ways that stereotypes are still present. Like, even in the stories we watch, the music we listen to, the stuff we buy, those messages are everywhere.
Right, that's where media literacy comes in. We need to learn how to analyze and deconstruct those messages, see the hidden biases, and then make more informed choices about what we consume.
It's about being an active viewer, not just absorbing everything without thinking about it. We have to ask questions, challenge what we're seeing, and look for those deeper meanings.
Totally. And don't forget, women aren't just passively watching all this stuff. They're creating media too, using those platforms to speak up, challenge those stereotypes, advocate for change.
Yeah, that's so important. Think about all the feminist blogs, the online communities, those social media movements. Women are really harnessing the power of the internet to connect with each other, share their stories, and build a collective voice.
It's powerful. It shows us that media can be a force for good.
For sure. It can be a way to promote social change, amplify those voices that are often marginalized.
Exactly.
And ultimately, I think it comes down to this. We all have a role to play in shaping the media landscape. We can choose to support the stuff that promotes positive, inclusive representations, right?
Yeah.
We can challenge the stuff that's harmful, and we can use our own voices, even if they seem small, to amplify the voices of those who aren't being heard.
Right, because media isn't just entertainment, it's powerful. It shapes how we see the world, how we act. It can actually transform society.
Well, folks, that brings us to the end of our deep dive on gender.
Wow, we covered a lot.
I know, right? We went from the basic definitions and theories to history, global trends, personal experiences, and now the media. It's been a wild ride.
It has. We really explored how complex gender is and how it connects to so many other parts of our lives. It's always evolving, always changing, but it's so important to understand.
It is. And as we wrap up, I'm feeling both hopeful and inspired. Hopeful because we're seeing progress towards gender equality, even if it's slow sometimes. And inspired by all the people and organizations out there who are fighting for change, breaking down barriers, and creating a more inclusive future for everyone.
I agree. It's a constant struggle, but it's a fight worth having. And the more we all understand about gender, the better equipped we are to challenge those harmful norms, to dismantle the systems that hold people back, and to build a world where everyone can truly thrive.
Couldn't have said it better myself. So listeners, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep talking about this stuff. This isn't the end of the conversation, it's just the beginning. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.